I'm thrilled to be here. I can't believe that there's so many people on a Sunday morning or midday to hear a talk on a 17th century Genoese artist, but here we are. I'm absolutely thrilled about this, and I'm handicapped a little bit because I normally don't read from talks. I don't read from papers. But in this case, because I know it's half translated, I'll try to go slow, and we'll bring everybody together. The other thing that I wanted to mention about is the first half is about the iconography of the painting. The second half is about Castiglione, his life, and a little bit of the context of why he's so famous. He's an obscure artist to most, largely because his art does not fit into the broad art historical outlines of Italian 17th century painting. His life story and artistic journey were both typical and atypical for his time. Like others, he trained in Genoa, went to Rome to seek his fortune by attracting wealthy clients. But unlike others, he traveled throughout the Italian peninsula, and this gives you some indication of the peripatetic journey of his artistic career. So unlike simply training in Rome and then coming back to settle in Genoa, he moved about the entire peninsula seeking fame and fortune. Along the way, he responded to a wide variety of stylistic and iconographic materials so much that he was much more like the Picasso of the Seicento than not. Few of his contemporaries had assimilated the breadth of the stylistic and iconographic sources as he had. Few were as committed to the interchangeability of media in which he worked, and few were as besotted with the handling and execution as he was. Despite what early biographers such as Raphael Soprani wrote of him in the late 1670s, we now know that Castiglione was more than just an animal specialist or a painter of patriarchal journeys such as this, his first signed and dated painting of 1633. He provided many portraits as well as produced many significant altarpieces, such as the Immaculate Conception of 1649 to 1650 for clients in the Marche. In fact, it's interesting that this painting, after it was painted, was exhibited for artists to look at before it left Rome to the clients in a small church in Osimo. Or, for example, he painted in the mid-1650s this incredible composition of the mystical crucifixion with Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, painted for a church in San Pier d'Arena to the west of Genoa. He also loved to paint mythological subjects such as the Deucalion in Pyrrha of 1653, now in Berlin. And he was also a brilliant etcher. Here an example of Circe, who would turn Ulysses' men into animals, of 1648. In fact, Castiglione was the first known artist to have modeled his prints after Rembrandt, but he's also the first person in Italy to have documented works so that the small figure of the Moor or the African here was taken from this print of 1636, and this young man here was seen over here in the print. And so we finally have some kind of documentation that he was not only stylistically, but he actually did look at Rembrandt's prints, probably through Flemish artists Cornelius and Lucas de Wael. But there's a difference between Rembrandt. Rembrandt is the exception because Rembrandt actually printed his own etchings. whereas Castiglione, following the norm of most printmakers in the 17th century, sold their plates to publishers, and the publishers would then print it. So I, Timothy Standring, artist, would etch my plate, and I would sell it to Andres, the publisher. He would give me 10 scudi, and then I would go away, and he would sell the print maybe for a scudo each, and possibly sell close to 100, 150 editions of an etching. He also, at the same time, throughout his career, looked at Titian, so that there's a drawing at Windsor Castle here, which was based on Sacred and Profane Love, now at Villa Borghese in Rome, as well as he spent a great deal of time in the mid-1630s paying attention to Nicolas Poussin. And we see in this drawing in a private collection in Texas was based on the Assumption of the Virgin Mary, which is in the National Gallery in Washington. But Castiglione also worked many of his subjects in monotypes. In fact, Guillermo, when he came in here early this morning, he was talking about how to make a monotype. A monotype is when you take a plate, it could be copper, zinc, even Degas used cellulose, sort of transparent early plastic. And you would put ink on top of that, and then you would dredge the ink away from the plate. And that sticky ink would then be covered with a damp sheet of paper. You would then put felt over the paper, and you would put it into the press, and that would be your one image or your monotype. Sometimes you have ink, residue ink on the plate, and that became a ghost or a cognate. And here's an example in which the first print is now in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. It was once owned by Vivant Denon, an advisor to Napoleon, and he purchased it in Venice. And the second impression is in Windsor Castle in the Royal Collection. In fact, the question is, why are there so many works at Windsor? It's because George III purchased the largest amount of drawings by Castiglione from his ambassador, Consul Smith, who purchased them from the Segreto family in Venice, who purchased them from the Gonzaga in Mantova, who stole them from the Castiglione family at the end of his death. But Castiglione is best known and remembered for his drawings in which they blur the boundaries between painting and drawing, especially his dry brush drawings. You're asking, what is a dry brush drawing? A dry brush drawing is when you tamp out, you take your brush and you tamp out as much of the liquid, whether it would be oil or, let's say, watercolor, the water in it, and it becomes very dry, and it drags the pigment across the surface of the paper. One of the reasons why you want to tampen out the brush is that you don't want the oil to stain the paper like a piece of bacon on a paper towel after you cook it on a Sunday morning. So what we're dealing with is also an artist who drew with oil pigments on unprimed paper. There are close to 500 of these sheets all across mostly Europe and North America, of which there's probably about 350, 375 which are authentic by Giovanni Benedetto Castiglione, But there's huge connoisseurship problems in which there's so many others by hands in his studio. This is a dry brush drawing, probably one of his masterpieces of the mid-1650s that relates to a painting which is in Kansas City. But unlike Castiglione did not do any hierarchical set of drawings preliminary to a painting. He seems to have simply gone straight to a painting after he had the concept of a composition in mind. Writing about Castiglione becomes more complicated when we weave his life episodes into a larger narrative of his artistic journey. Many trial documents, such as this is known as a filza. It's a file. There are over 500 sheets in this. They're wrapped together in a string. And this was from a notary called Innocenzo Sestri of 1656. And the way that you would find a document is you would pull out the index or the pendetta, and guess how the index is indicated? By first names. What's the most popular name in Italian? Giovanni. So there's page after page after page of Giovanni Sestri, Giovanni Nessuno, Giovanni Ignoto, Giovanni Benedetto, Giovanni Battista Castiglione, and you'd have to go down the file until you have a number, and that number then leads you to a page, and you would pull out a page such as this document, and you'd find out that this is actually one of the rarest documents in Italian 17th century archival history. I'm saying this humbly, but it's the only contract that we know in which it's a artist producing a work, and in this case it's Giovanni Benedetto Castiglione, providing a work of art over 4 years, once a month, to this individual called Desiderio de Ferrari. These kind of single artist contracts existed in the north, in Holland, but it's the first time that we find this kind of condition in Italian painting. One of the reasons why we don't have many documents on artists is because they bartered. In other words, for services with an attorney, he bartered and gave the attorney works of art. In fact, that's how I discovered at least 12 trials that Castiglione was in, because when I spent a sabbatical year in '95 in Genoa, I discovered a 75-page document for roughly the equivalent of a suit between Castiglione and his attorney for the equivalent of 500 euros. The attorney said that Castiglione didn't pay him enough, and Castiglione said that the attorney was so horrible that that's why he was in 12 suits. But out of the depositions came a lot of interesting information. It's the first time we know that Castiglione had a workshop, because many of the participants in the workshop gave information and said, yes, he gave an original drawing to the attorneys for payment. The document that we're looking at on this is perhaps one of the most interesting pieces. And when you have a trial in the 17th century, you have the plaintiff on the one hand, the defendants on the other, and you go ahead in front of a court of 3 judges. And each side submits questions to the judges, and those statements and questions are then either accepted or denied by the judges as to having merit in the trial. So the attorneys gave a lot of dirt horrible information about the Castiglione and his brother Salvatore that brought out a great deal of the ugly character of our rogue genius. Castiglione was basically a curmudgeon. He threatened to push his sister off a rooftop. He sued a servant, knowing that the servant could not countersue him because of lack of funding to file the suit. He used vile language that I had to ask the archivist, is this really as vulgar as it is? Yes, it is. And also in one instance, an individual testified that Castiglione and his brother fled Rome in 1650, and they had to provide pots, pans, mattresses, canvas, and even mutandini. So mutandini, I went up to the archivist and she started screaming and laughing. She said, "What are you reading here?" And I said, "Well, this is what the document said." The person had to provide underpants for Castiglione as well. And I said, "Well, what's happening?" "Well, he had to flee, possibly because he committed a capital crime. And I'd like to follow that up and go through the court documents in Rome to verify why Castiglione and his brother had to flee so quickly." There are many other. This is just corroborative, but out of this one trial document came a great deal about the character of this individual. So we're dealing with an artist whose stylistic complexities and life story 400 years ago challenge us to think outside the boundaries of the narratives that have already been told about him. So the biographies in the 17th century are mostly hagiography. They're like lives of the saints. They're only going to tell you good things. They're not going to tell you really bad things. And the only biography that does include any suspicion about his character was never actually published. It only exists in a manuscript, and it's by Niccolo Pio. But here's the issue. His career serves as an excellent case study on how an individual, and perhaps one who has considered himself as an outsider, as Castiglione, emerges to become a professional artist, strives to acquire fame, and then somehow fails in his efforts. He did not fail, however, when he painted Diogenes looking for an honest man. In the lives of the most eminent philosophers, the historian Diogenes Laertius tells the anecdote about the philosopher Diogenes the Cynic, who died in 323 BC, who lit a lamp in broad daylight and said that he went about, "I am looking for a man." Instead of placing the Cynic philosopher searching in an urban setting, Castiglione places him amidst a decayed world of a past civilization. He filled the setting with remnants of classical architecture and statuary, discarded pottery, travel gear, trophies of the hunt, scattered bones. He doesn't find the ideal, but instead discovers a world inhabited by a river god with a dried up source, a mischievous, excited-looking satyr, and an odd bevy of animals, a buffalo, turkey, calf, a pair of rabbits. It's a post-apocalyptic world, but one with a twist. The inhabitants are enjoying themselves. He's actually found Los Angeles. Given his penchant for veiled meanings in many of his subjects, it is not unlikely that he gave additional meaning to all of the animals that could be read and decoded by viewers of such a painting. The tortoise, for example, might represent sloth, the monkey, ignorance, and so forth. A number of his contemporaries had depicted Diogenes, such as Salvatore Rosa and Giuseppe Ribera, but none in Italy had depicted him searching for a man that was much more common in the north, such as this picture by Jacob Jordaens of around 1650 with his workshop, which is quite common. Instead, Castiglione produced a print of this subject and signed and dated it 1648, and also gave a dedication to the print, which was added income to the publisher. And it also includes these letters down below said that it had passed the censor of the Vatican at the time that it could be printed, and it also gives an advertisement where you can buy the print. Keep in mind, in the pre-encyclopedic age in the 17th century, that 17th century humanist Protestants and Catholics in Rome would have purchased prints like this and passed them around at evening soirees to talk about the significance and meaning of such imagery. So the print likely preceded the painting, and he was basically following a method of marketing that was quite common in the 17th century. Salvatore Rosa did the same thing, although he shows another episode of the life of the philosopher in which Diogenes is met with Alexander the Great, and the emperor asks Diogenes what he might do for him, and Diogenes says, "Get out of the way, you're blocking the sunlight." So Castiglione's protagonist in both his print and subsequent painting may allude to an updated version of the medieval figure known as Elk, or everyman. Elk is written, and he's shown throughout this composition by Peter Bruegel the Elder of 1558, the drawing of which is in the British Museum. This is the reproductive print published by Hieronymus Koch of the same date with additional information in it. Castiglione had access to many Flemish prints in Genoa when he was working with Paggi, his master. Also other Genoese collectors such as Balbi, Girolamo Balbi also owned a number of Flemish prints. But we need to explain some of the elements of this overall composition because of the plausible meaning in this print bears on the meaning of Castiglione's own. Elk means each or everyone or every man, and the scenes in this drawing illustrate proverbs and sayings. The central proverb concerns Elk, who vainly seeks himself in the objects of this world as he stands over a broken glass. With a lantern, he searches through a pile of barrels and bales, a game board, cards, and objects which signify the distractions of life. To the left, two more elk figures play tug-of-war with a swath of cloth, illustrates the saying, "Each tugs for the longest end." In the background on the wall hangs a picture which constitutes a moral theme. It shows a fool sitting among a pile of broken household objects, gazing at himself in a mirror. He is Nemo, or nobody, as the inscription informs us. Nobody knows himself. In this moralizing image, Bruegel condemns the selfish pursuit of worldly goods, but he also shows through the picture of the fool, perhaps an image of the president-elect, a way of conquering vice. Only through the self-knowledge can Elk free himself from the world's vanities. As Nadine Orenstein comments on this print, in keeping with the predilection of 16th century humanists and rhetoricians for playing with several layers of meanings at once, and for veiled and intricate references to the Bible, classical antiquity, and literature, we must recognize there are multiple readings of every man that overlap and supplement each other. In other words, the meaning revolves around the vain search for every man, for both worldly goods as well as for knowledge. Bruegel may have intended the lighted lantern to allude to Diogenes and his searching, and borrowed the motif from Guillaume de la Perrière, who shows the ancient philosopher in his search for the evidence of his sagacity in La Morosifiée of 1553. Bruegel's inclusion of every man in the barrel may allude to the scene we had already looked at with Salvator Rosa's print with Alexander the Great. So the richness of the print comes through the layered meanings, very much like Castiglione probably had layered meanings in his Diogenes seeking an honest man at the Prado. Humanists would be able to decode much of the meaning very much the way that we can decode images today. This is very much the way we read images. Here are two images of Homer as superhero everyman on the left, fit and trim, and on the right, the gluttonous Homer who explodes from overeating when his celebrity trainer departs for other clients. In 2009, Castiglione followed this humanistic tradition by creating a picture in print that appealed to educated audiences who understood how to read these multi-layered meanings into such images. But trying to identify exactly what Castiglione had identified for his Diogenes is difficult to pin down, and it's at the heart of what makes the history of art so compelling. So here's the dilemma for me. Is Diogenes a personification of the vilified, downtrodden artist himself? Is Castiglione just pandering to an erudite client who dictated such an image? Is he truly, Castiglione, truly a painter, philosopher in the tradition of humanist painters such as Poussin? Or is he pandering to the market interested in acquiring such compositions? He might have viewed the philosopher as discovering a world that might have been preferable to the former iteration or civilizations. He suggests that although Diogenes does not find the honest man he is searching, he nevertheless discovers a subhuman world quite self-sufficient and happy despite the barren terrain and the dried-up river. Isn't this an incredible detail? The reason why I included this detail is because it's extraordinary, the condition of this painting. Most of Castiglione's paintings, sadly, have been overcleaned and scrubbed down and have lost much of the surface of their paintings, whereas this picture is really among the top 10 of the best surviving paintings by Castiglione. And he didn't have to go far finding types of Oriental-looking figures. All he had to do is go down to the port and simply look at the various Eastern Mediterranean types that he could have seen and place them into these small figureheads, which follow, by the way, as well Rembrandt's images of tronies or these fantastical heads of individuals. So he's given the relatively tight handling and order of the composition. He probably painted this in Rome sometime during the late 1640s or early 1650s. And the early provenance of the painting stems from the collection of the Roman painter Carlo Maratta, who then sold it to the Royal Collection. It's listed in Murata's inventory in 1712, and then later is listed in many of the Spanish inventories, and now in the Prado. Castiglione did a brush drawing of this subject, which is at Windsor. And as I said earlier, it's misleading to think that he created a hierarchy of, let's say, a sketch, a composition, studies of drapery, and maybe even a presentation drawing prior to the execution of the painting. He simply would either work it up in a print or in a drawing such as this, and then move on to the painting. Here's a good lesson. Although this is a multicolored dry brush drawing at Windsor, we did not include it in the recent exhibition that traveled from Buckingham Palace to Edinburgh and Denver and Fort Worth, simply because it was overcleaned and it was completely bleached. And so the white character of this is not consistent with most of the brush drawings that you see of Castiglione. The rich iconography, the exotic subject matter, the farrago of animals, and the sunlit landscape, and the many still life objects in this painting attest to Castiglione as a brilliant painter. Before I get back to the painting itself, what I wanted to show you as well is that a painting such as this would precede the painting, very much like the print of this church would precede the painting such as that. And so let me move on now to a little bit more about Castiglione, his life, and perhaps why his fame exists today. His nickname was called Il Grecchetto, which could also mean the little Greek. If you look in 17th century Italian dictionaries on Grecchetto, it means ornato. It could be like Hellenistic Greek sculpture. It's ornate, ostentatious. And I think that he actually spent time with a group of Flemish painters, or painters from the north in Rome, called the Bamboccianti, and that they would gather together in the spring and go to Santa Costanza, because there's a tomb with a lot of putti with garlands of grapes and grape crushing, and they would all have too much wine and get drunk and have this bacchanalian activity. They would scratch their name on the walls, and they put their nicknames on the walls. And I think that Castiglione was very much a part of that culture, and hence his nickname. But his fame really resides, I think, in late 17th and early 18th century connoisseurs of drawings, mostly around Venice, and then transferring over to Paris. He was a household name among writers in the 18th century journals. He was called Le Benedetto, and he was collected by most of the major connoisseurs of 18th century Paris. When we had the exhibition in Denver, I would show a number of artists a drawing such as this. And I would ask them, how do you think that drawing was made? And they would say, oh, well, that's a red chalk drawing, or that's a Conti drawing, Conti crayon drawing. And I'd say, well, you're wrong on two counts. It's not red chalk, it's not Conti because it hadn't been invented yet, but it's actually a dry brush drawing with oil on unprimed paper. But you can see a little bit of the stain of the oil had worked through the paper. This is David and Saul, which is at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. Well, what happened with all of these 500 or so drawings is that Castiglione, throughout his career, actually learned how to really work with this medium of oil paint on unprimed paper. And his earlier paintings show too much saturation of the oil seeping through the paper, and that as he continued throughout his career, as he's hopscotching, borrowing like a magpie from everybody on the face of the earth. So he's just integrating all of these various motifs. It's kind of like the Beatles and their music throughout their entire career. And so here he's looking at Poussin, but he's able to balance the oils against the pigments, and then he pulls this off brilliantly of Circe, who just turned Ulysses' men into animals this is from the early to the mid 1650s. Keep in mind that Castiglione's painting, not only, I think that he actually applied pigment with sticks and the end of his brushes, as well as with very stiff boar bristle brushes that you can see throughout many of these drawings. His drawings, a mélange of both drawing and painting, brings us closer to his creative and imaginative energy. Perhaps this is why contemporary observers were verbally challenged and struggled in their attempts to characterize them. His earliest biographer, Raphael Soprani, clearly equates the artist disegno with virtuoso handling by claiming il disegno del Castiglione è elegante, il suo tocco è grazioso e facile. At the same time, it's a rather vague description, saying it's gracious and it's easily handled, but it's elliptical and it really doesn't get to the heart of what Castiglione was doing, and I don't think that the critical language existed in the 17th century to give him his due. It wasn't until the mid to the end of the 17th, beginning of the 18th century, and it's largely a function of the market of finally recognizing and collecting drawings for their own merits. Castiglione always had this distinctive maniera, a maniera that informs virtually all of his works on paper. At the same time, he never abandoned a sensibility of naturalism. In fact, this incipient duality holds even as he continues to absorb additional inspiration from others, which appears strongly throughout the mid-1630s in Rome. Now, the next two paragraphs, I'm going to mention a lot of artists and a lot of styles. So just bear with me. The point that I'm making is that what he did is he went from classicism, borrowing from the works of Domenichino and Sacchi, as well as Venetianism, from examples of Venetian painting in Genoa or Rome. But then throughout the mid-1640s, he continues to assimilate from yet even larger and perhaps surprisingly diverse sphere of sources, drawing much from the rhetoric of Reni, Lanfranco, Bernini's theatrics, the psychological intimacy and technical intensity of Rembrandt's prints, and the challenges posed by Poussin's paintings. The exercise doesn't end in the 1640s. Later in his career, he begins to absorb Parmigianino. So tell me another artist that absorbs as many different sources from as many different artists in the 17th century. There are none. And so what's interesting is that Castiglione, in his Diogenes searching for an honest man, was finally able to combine his early expertise in painting animals, painting landscape, painting still life, and combine it with a pseudo-philosophical theme much in the tradition of, let's say, Poussin. His appropriations from others were opportunistic and strongly motivated to overcome any self-perceived insufficiencies he may have harbored. He spent his career learning to trust his own idiosyncratic approach to achieve his artistic ends. Looking at the larger picture, Castiglione may be considered the poster child of what historians regard as an issue of center and periphery. His art has been difficult to categorize within the nomenclature and broader outlines of Seicento art history that are available. It may have been so that Castiglione responded to so many different artists. In other words, the problem may have been because they didn't know how to deal with Genoese art. So the history still needs to be written for Genoese artists as well as the Genoese school, with as much clarity, nuance, and depth as those emerging for Bolognese, Neapolitan, Florentine, and Roman artists. A close reading of the issues surrounding the artistic career of Giovanni Benedetto Castiglione would perhaps fill this void. He proclaimed himself a genius in a print of 1649 or 1650, Genuum Io, in which he proclaims, "I am a genius." Writes it on the book here. He made it and invented it. Drums are snaring, the horn is blowing, all is fecund, there's eggs, rabbits are procreating. The crown of glory is about to arrive, and here's the allegorical figure with his tam or beret feathered in the Iconologia by Cesare Ripa, which shows fecundity. He's commenting in some way on drawing, because the irony is that he took this entire motif from a frontispiece of a very humble drawing instruction manual. The instruction manual is not theoretical, it's simply a pattern book of noses, eyes, ears. And Castiglione in his workshop actually devised drawings and sketches on the back of some of Castiglione's prints exactly from this instruction manual. So given his infrequent movements throughout the Italian peninsula, his inability to settle in his native Genoa or to participate in the community affairs of the many cities in which he is said to have lived, as well as the fact that he died relatively impoverished, it is surprising that he possesses even the degree of fame that he does, and yet he does. In the final analysis, it is largely because many connoisseurs and artists prized his paintings and drawings, paintings such as the Prado picture, for its merits. They also reacted strongly to the technical flourish and responded to his predilection for the non-finito. It may have been a strange fate of fortune that what in the end probably was his most cherished and privately held possession, his corpus of drawings, and not the more public works of his altarpieces, his mythological paintings, his portraits, and his other works known to have been collected throughout Italy, that did the most to preserve his artistic fame and fortune. There is little, for example, of any contemporary response to his works during his lifetime. In fact, what many learned about the artist stems from the few biographies written shortly after his lifetime, but these are generally hagiography that can be now read against the clutch of newly discovered documents that have been discovered over the past 20 years. More likely, his fame resulted from that of his works themselves, since his drawings were sought after and collected by many 18th century artists and connoisseurs alike. Their enthusiasm, more than the words written about them, guaranteed his inclusion in the canon of major artists working in Italy throughout the 17th century. Here in the 21st century, it is an open debate among historians whether these biographical facts offer a richer meaning to his art. While the poet Auden claimed that an artist's life should remain unknown, I think it would be difficult to completely ignore his life stories while we wonder about this artist who created such fascinating images as he did. Thank you so much.